This time on Poll Hub, what are we running, an old age home around here? That might be an accurate summation of the way a large majority of Americans feel about the advanced age of many of our top political leaders, from Biden to McConnell to Feinstein to Trump. But there's an interesting way to look at this through a generational and partisan lens, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, Boomer? Then, are we, pollsters, asking the wrong questions? That question is not a new one, but researchers have raised it again in the context of our hyper-partisan, or maybe more accurately, hyper-tribal American culture. We're going to toss that one around the table. And we finish with another question, one that you have almost certainly asked yourself as you dreamed of a life you could only have if... Stick around for that one. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I am Lee Danienbaum.
So there has been a lot of ink spilled, probably not the term to use nowadays, digital ink, TV time spent on the question of how old is too old for our elected officials. A lot of this has to do with Joe Biden. He's the oldest president. If he runs for re-election, he's going to be, well past the age of our prior oldest presidents by the time he would leave office. But there's also a lot of talk about this because of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and a couple of freezes he's had in front of the cameras. There's a lot of talk about this because of Diane Feinstein, senator from California, who is 90 and is clearly has some issues with communicating. So there's been a lot of discussion about this and about how old is too old, and should we have limits on how old our elected officials should be. A couple brand new polls about this. One is a new Economist YouGov survey. Large majority of Americans believe there should be a maximum age for somebody to serve as president. That's 76%. Senator, 73%. Or a member of Congress, 72%. And then there's a new Wall Street Journal poll that shows 73% of Americans say Biden is too old, that's the words, to run for president. But then they asked it a little bit differently. In a split question, they asked half of the respondents if he's mentally up for the job. And 60% said he's not mentally up for the job. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy there, depending on how you ask the question. But the bottom line is, the majority of Americans don't think Biden is young enough, or he's too old, however you want to do it, to be president. This isn't necessarily new, though. Lee, you have mentioned Strom Thurmond in the past, who reached 100 as a senator. There have been questions about this in the past. Why is it different this time?
Well, I think it's as you mentioned. I think we're sometimes seeing this more through a partisan lens, where my older candidate's okay, but yours isn't, basically. And I think that's probably why. Look, in decades gone by, the seniority. The committee chairmen were very often a bunch of elderly white senators from the South who were sort of calling the shots. And I'm not sure how old they were, but they sure, to a younger me, looked a lot older than some of these people are today. And I think, look, the question is one of competency and whether you can accept the fact that 80 is the new 70, that people are active longer, that you're doing things more. And then I think it becomes an individual partisan case. So Joe Biden has talked about a stutter when he was young. He has it mostly under control, but very often when he stutters and kind of slips through something, that's seen as a sign that he's not in charge of his faculties and he's not, making decisions. Someone else is running the show. And that's a partisan attack. I remember when Hillary Clinton, during the campaign, had a memorial service for 9/11. She kind of fell. She may have had a case, I believe, with elderly of pneumonia. It was called a stroke by her opposition. Ronald Reagan famously was seen as too old by a lot of Democrats. And he even made for those of you who remember, a joke about his age in the second debate, because on the first debate, he was telling a story that sort of never ended and left it wide open for whether he was up for the next 4 years. So I think we're a little hypercritical on this, but I think, where you stand depends upon where you sit. And I certainly have passed the traditional retirement age, so I'm less sensitive, or maybe more sensitive, but less concerned about this. I think it has to do with motivation, desire, competency. And we have a lot of young senators who are doing a lot of things that I have a lot of problems with, which strikes to me as maybe a value slippage rather than a cognitive one, but it gets us in the same place.
I was really surprised when we were kind of looking to talk about this topic that Ronald Reagan's age when he was first elected was 69. And I remember the conversations about his age, and I thought he was absolutely ancient.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by today's standards, he would actually, be bringing down the age of our presidential candidate. So I agree with Lee in that it does become a very partisan issue. And, one of the things, if we look at the recent Congress, because the previous Congress, the one that was either reelected or kicked out in 2022, was actually the oldest Congress that we had had. And we had an election in 2022, and by golly, the average age of our Congress has declined 3 years to 58 years of age. For senators, it's 64 years. In the House, it's 57. But surprise, surprise, we actually got some young blood in there. And so I tend to lean on the side of we have elected officials and they are elected officials. And we have a pretty arduous process for getting elected, whether it's for president or Congress or pretty much any elected office that we have. And I kind of lean on the side of let the electorate deal with it. Oddly enough, if we look at this current Congress, the oldest were born in the 1930s, and they're mostly Democrats. And the youngest were born in the 1980s, and they're mostly Democrats and Latino. So I think the process does take care of itself.
I think our friend Philip Bump from the Washington Post had an interesting take on this too, because he looked at all this talk about this and said, why is Biden, who's only 3 years older than Trump, getting so much more attention for being too old and Trump is not? And he looked at who the voters are and how old they are. And so older voters, Gen X, and then into the boomers lean more Republican, and more of Trump's base are of that age group. And younger voters tend to be more Democratic. And younger voters are the ones who are more, hey, this guy's too old. And so there's more demographic base in the Democratic Party that's younger, and they have the old candidate. They both have old candidates, but they're more critical. So I thought that was interesting. But I also wonder if this is just the final kind of rattle. I don't want to say death rattle. That's bad because I'm a boomer. But is this the boomers were a huge generation, and it's not as huge a generation anymore. As time goes on, it'll get smaller and smaller. Is this just the passing of the torch? Right. And this is kind of the end of the boomer, heyday.
Yeah, well, although we thought that when Bill Clinton was running, a new generation was coming. But with the oddity,
but he was a boomer. No,
yes,
but he replaced the silent generation. So he was the coming of the boomers.
We did move on.
So,
right. Yeah, we.
And I know you hate these conversations, Lee. That we're sort of getting rid of the boomers and the.
But we're all boomers. All three of us are boomers.
In a not so gracious way.
Yeah, well, I would say this. I do find it in the somewhat odd in our current period that most of our presidential candidates or political leaders in Washington are like older than I am in my early 70s. So if you had, I thought by this point, younger folks would be taking the mantle. And yet you have people like Hillary Clinton's older, Bernie Sanders, Feinstein you mentioned, former President Trump. I mean, these are all people pushing 80 and yet very prominent. And that may be part of what the comments are being derived from also because, there's just a lot of people who are major people. Mitch McConnell, of course, you mentioned earlier, and they're just older. And power to them if they can still do it and they're still motivated. But I think, as you say, the younger folks are going to start increasingly looking for someone who may be a little bit closer in age to them than these other folks are.
So, but are we really asking the right question, about age, or is it about competency, or is it about our tribalism? And
that's a good segue.
It's a half-hearted way of segueing into our next topic, which is are pollsters actually asking the right questions? We see so many results that we kind of scratch our heads and think, how could people really think that way? And it's on both sides, because I think we've become, much more polarized, and we kind of follow a certain worldview. So do our questions really need to change and become different? Do the old standards no longer fit? Well, there is a study that was done by a number of researchers, serious pollster researchers, and detailed in August Atlantic Monthly. And it was done by a methodologist at Newark, University of Chicago, a Yale professor, another professor from Temple University, and a research scientist from SurveyMonkey. So
the real deal. These are the real deal here.
Yeah, they're certainly not slackers. And what their question was is, because we've reached this tone in our politics, are we actually, as pollsters, able to get honest answers? Or are people just kind of giving us the tribal mantra, the talking point? And should we as pollsters now be asking questions in different ways? So I pose that to you guys. Are we on base? Are we measuring what we think we are measuring? I mean, that's been a question pollsters have asked themselves since I think polling has began.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the segment is actually, you said it was titled, "Are we asking the right questions?" And on my script, it actually says, "Are we asking the wrong questions?" So right there, you have a difference in question wording on the title. And maybe there's a difference in are we asking the right questions or the wrong questions? Because maybe that leads us in a certain direction that's different. If you say right questions, I say, sure. Wrong questions, maybe I think that too. So half full, half empty. I do think that a lot of this does have to do with the silos that we live in and the perceptions that we have, and how much is fact going to be driving our interpretation. If I told you that Joe Biden, or I asked you a question about a piece of fictitious legislation, Joe Biden has now advocated right off the bat how Democrats and Republicans are going to respond to the name of Joe Biden in that question rather than what the question and the policy is being advocated. Same would be true for Donald Trump on the other side. So, yeah, I think the tribalism is taking hold here. And, when we were all being trained in questionnaire running, we just want to make them balanced and neutral. But there's a lot of buzzwords out there, and people are, reacting to that. So it changes the way people are going to respond.
So Jay, this is not something that is just an issue for pollsters. In your media journalism career, it's pretty important to be asking the right question. And it's not necessarily asking the question in the most obvious way.
Yeah, well, and that's exactly why we've done a couple of segments over the last year. And I've kind of pressed this question of why on the economy, for instance, people feel that it's in such bad shape if they're Republicans, and Democrats feel it's in better shape. And we've talked about the inflation and all that. We've talked about whether it's the media portraying things in a certain way. My question is really back to you, Barb, because this is your thing, right? You understand this inside and out. So when we talk about asking a question about the economy, and we know that if we say, how's the economy doing? We know we're going to get back an answer that's one way if you're a Trump supporter and another way if you're a Biden supporter. How do we go about thinking about asking that question in a different way that gets people to, in effect, tell us the truth? Or is the truth their lived truth, their partisan belief? In other words, if I'm a Republican, I do not believe the economy is going well right now. Despite the fact that if that person opens your bank book to us, we can say, well, but you're doing better than you were 4 years ago. But they don't believe that. And in the same way, Democrats wouldn't believe the economy was doing better in the Trump era, even if they opened their bank books and said that. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, are people telling us the truth? And it's the truth that doesn't reflect reality, but it is their truth.
And I would argue probably that it is the latter. Because I don't adhere to the idea of that people lie to pollsters in such a common way that it actually changes the data. I think we are living in two very different worldviews. And part of that is who we talk with, who we're friends with, who our families are, what we read, what we decide to view, and who we root for. For instance, the New York Giants can do no wrong. And I'm very much looking forward to the football season. And, the Dallas Cowboys, who are also in the same division, can do no right. They may have called themselves America's team, but Knights are New Yorkers. And I think our politics has reflected a lot of that. I'm not sure that is something that's new. One of the things back in the day when, Lee, you were talking about, when we're constructing questions, we want them to be balanced and objective.
Yeah.
Words matter. And we were always taught to use the most simple of words, because it's not that people don't understand language. It's that's just the more complicated and nuanced a word is, the less likely it is to mean the same thing to everyone. And so our goal is, at least if we are asking a question, the words that we're using should mean the same thing across the board. And then people are using their own experiences, their own attitudes, their own values. And Jay, you really do tap into something, because people generally, I think, answer questions regarding their beliefs and their values. And we have a whole history and a whole science of not just polling, but research in the social sciences and research in journalism, which does point to the fact that although it's important to make sure that your question is properly worded, that it is possible to measure these things.
Yeah, and this is a problem that's as old as survey research and the methodologies, and isn't going to be solved just because we're in a more tribal period. There's a lot of issues that go into this, and this is really the art side of surveys, and not necessarily, the right or wrong side. But we try, I think the honest effort is that those in the survey research business are, doing their best for the most part to kind of like get to where they need to go. But then there is, as Jay was talking about, there's the perception of reality, and that may be very much part of what they're all about. However, this problem would be solved. Watch for the segue. If I won a lottery, I wouldn't have to worry about these things, because there's other things I could do than conducting surveys. Well, surprise, surprise, at the Wilper Center, they report on a poll that was done, I was going to say in 1989, not that far back, and basically said if you won $1 million lottery, which today after taxes isn't quite as much as it feels, which one of the following would you most likely do? Start your own business, try a new profession, go back to school, quit your job and not work at all, and then volunteer, and do any of those. And it's just kind of a split response. 27%, the plurality said start your own business, which I think is kind of like a little weird, because if I just won $1 million or maybe $10 million by today's standards, I don't think I'm looking to invest. I'm not looking to do that. Anyway, quit your job and not work at all, I think would be a more popular choice if the money was a little bit higher by today's standards. Go back to school. I can't argue with that. Try a new profession, I think would also, at 7%, gain a higher popularity right now in response than it did back then. But there's other things that you might want to do that you weren't given a choice here, because these were the choices. And so you sort of have to sign up to one of them. But what are you doing with your $1 million lottery, folks?
Well, I do think it's interesting, Lee, that I hope they at some point collected the volunteered answers, because that was almost a quarter. And somehow I think that would be much more entertaining than the choices people were given by the pollsters. Talk about, creating questions that don't necessarily tap into what people are thinking.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to think about the lottery, I kind of think about the Mega Millions and those big lottery wins. I kind of wonder what happens to people once they win that $500 million. And for me, I wouldn't mind winning $1 million. That would that would fit my lifestyle. But I've been always a little bit worried of winning too much money, because it sounds like, you have to be a bit too responsible with it.
Well, a lot of people say that people who win tons and tons of money actually kind of like cleared away.
I would just feel like I'd have to do something responsible with it.
Jay?
And then
your
manage
good,
What's the choices
and
here,
then
Jay?
and then manage it.
that's your good upbringing, Barbara. That's your good upbringing. So
No,
three
I'm
things.
good with $1 million. I'm good with $1
There you
million.
go.
I would have fun with $1 million.
So three things about this. One, I love that the sponsor is Chex Cereal. This is the first poll that we've had from Chex Cereal. Two, $1 million. I agree. We should re-ask this question as a fun question, but as a billion. I mean, these billion-dollar lotteries happen every few months now, and $1 million, even in 1989, I think that's where you get some of these answers from. $1 million, even in 1989, was not like I'm going to retire to my own island. It just wasn't. So big dollars, I think you'd get different answers. And then the one that I find, actually, all of this, the third thing that I find so interesting is that the choices they made are so American. Start your own business, try a new profession, go back to school. The only one that's kind of not, and that I think, a lot of us would probably choose is quit my job and not work at all, maybe volunteer or whatever. It just seems to me that when they were constructing this, it's constructed in a very go get them, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of American way. Yeah. So those are my thoughts. I would, $1 million. I'm not doing anything. I'm just going to stick it in the retirement account, maybe pay for the garage I'm building.
If it was $1 billion, so what would you do with it?
$1 billion, I would start my own foundation. I would quit. Sorry, guys. I volunteer with you sometimes. But yeah, I would start my own foundation. Yes, I have thought about it. Who hasn't thought about this? Like lying in bed lying in bed or awake at night, waiting for the drawing and going, $1 billion. What do I do with $1 billion? I would start my own foundation, and my job would be to give it away.
That's very nice. And Barb, what would you actually do with $1 billion? Not the million, the billion.
Not the million, the billion. Yeah, there would be, I think, again, that you have to manage it and you have to do something responsible with it.
Save more horses.
Perhaps it might be a horse rescue, but I probably would, after I got the big farm and the indoor arena and all of that, I think it would be some kind of investment in community activities because, that's too much money to be.
So I spent a couple of days this past week up in Newport looking at some of the Gilded Age mansions. And I walked through some of those. And one thing I probably would not do is buy one of those. There's no place to put your feet up, watch TV, play ping pong. It's all very ornate. And it was fun to look at, fun to imagine, but not necessarily what I would construct with my next $1 billion.
When you win that $1 billion, just remember us.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ethan Hollis.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcast app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
Everyone's a winner.